The antique pocket watch dangled from the small hand like a pendulum marking time itself, catching the cold fluorescent light as the child pushed through the heavy mahogany doors. Her voice barely carried across the cavernous boardroom when she spoke, a whisper against the suffocating silence of power and money that hung in the air like expensive cologne. "Excuse me," the girl said, her eyes wide and uncertain as she took in the sea of tailored suits and leather chairs. "My dad dropped this." 12 executives froze mid-sentence, their discussions of quarterly earnings and market projections evaporating as they stared at this impossible interruption, this violation of their carefully constructed world of spreadsheets and strategy. At the head of the table, Sophia Bennett felt her carefully maintained composure begin to crack as her eyes locked onto the object swinging from the child's fingers, and something deep in her chest tightened like a fist closing around her heart. The chain was silver, tarnished with age in a way that spoke of decades rather than years, and even from across the vast expanse of polished wood, Sophia could see the distinctive scrollwork on the case, the kind of craftsmanship that didn't exist anymore except in dusty antique shops and inherited treasures. Her hands gripped the edge of the table hard enough that her knuckles went white, hard enough that the wood seemed to groan under the pressure, and she heard her own voice emerge strangled and foreign. "Where did you get that?" The little girl blinked, confusion washing over her features as she instinctively pulled the watch closer to her chest. A protective gesture that any child makes when an adult's tone suggests they might have done something wrong. "It's my dad's," the girl said, her voice smaller now, defensive. "He left it in the supply closet where he was working. I'm trying to find him so I can give it back." Sophia stood slowly, feeling like she was moving through water, through time itself, each second stretching into an eternity as she walked toward the child. And behind her she heard David Morrison, her chief operating officer, lean forward in his chair with concern etched across his features. "Sophia, what's going on? You look like you've seen a ghost." But Sophia couldn't answer him because she was staring at something that should have been at the bottom of a lake 9 years ago, something that should have been lost forever in dark water and darker circumstances, something that represented the end of everything she'd known and loved. Her hand trembled violently as she reached toward the child, and she had to force her voice to work, had to push the words out past the lump in her throat that felt like it might choke her. "Can I see it? Just for a moment." The girl's grip tightened, her small fingers wrapping around the watch with surprising strength. "But I need to give it back to my dad. He'll be looking for it. He always has it with him." Something in Sophia's expression, some raw desperation that transcended the usual adult-child dynamic, made the girl slowly extend her hand, offering the watch like a sacred relic. The metal was cold against Sophia's palm, worn smooth by thousands of touches, and she turned it over with shaking fingers to reveal the engraving on the back, words she'd traced with her own fingers countless times before. "Every moment is a gift. Spend it wisely." Her father's initials, his life philosophy distilled into 8 words. The inscription he'd had carved into this watch when Sophia was just a baby. William Bennett's watch, the one he wore every single day without fail, the one he was wearing when his car plunged off that bridge 9 years ago into the river below, the one the police said was lost forever in the murky depths along with his body that was never recovered. "This isn't possible," Sophia whispered, her voice breaking on each syllable as the room began to spin around her, as 9 years of carefully constructed acceptance and grief began to crumble like a sand castle facing an incoming tide. David's voice cut through her shock, sharp with concern and something else, something that might have been fear. "Sophia, talk to us. What's happening?" She looked up at him, then back at the child who was watching her with growing worry, and managed to form the question that was burning through her mind. "Who is your father? What's his name?" The girl shifted her weight from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable with all the adult attention focused on her like spotlights. "Michael Reed. He works here cleaning the offices at night. He's the custodian." Sophia had never heard that name in her entire life, not once in all the years she'd been running Bennett Technologies, and she felt something cold and terrible settling in her stomach. "How long has he had this watch? Where did he get it?" The girl shrugged with the casual indifference of childhood. "I don't know. He's always had it, I think. For as long as I can remember. 9 years ago, Sophia's world had ended on a rainy Tuesday evening when police knocked on her door to tell her that her father's car had been found at the bottom of a ravine, having apparently skidded off a bridge during a storm, and after weeks of searching the murky water below, they declared him dead without ever recovering his body, and she'd buried an empty casket while rain poured down like the sky itself was mourning. "Get him!" Sophia's voice cracked like a whip across the stunned silence, making several executives jump in their seats. "Get this Michael Reed up here right now. I need to speak with him immediately." David stood, his face a mask of concern that did nothing to hide the tension in his shoulders. "Sophia, let's think about this rationally. We're in the middle of a critical quarterly review and the man probably just found the watch somewhere, bought it at a pawn shop. There are a million reasonable explanations for this." She turned to face him, and something in her expression made him take a step back. "I said get him, David. Now." The authority in her voice, the raw command that came from being the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar technology company, left no room for argument, and David reached for the phone on the wall to call security. Sophia looked back at the watch in her trembling hand, at her father's careful engraving, at the silver case that had been his constant companion, and she felt something crack open inside her chest that she'd sealed shut 9 years ago. If this watch was here, if some custodian she'd never heard of had somehow acquired it, then someone had been lying to her for almost a decade, and as she looked up and caught the expressions around the conference table, David's clenched jaw, the nervous glances exchanged between board members who'd been with the company since her father's time, Sophia Bennett realized with a sickening certainty that the lies ran deeper than she could have possibly imagined. And this was only the beginning of the truth she was about to uncover. Security escorted Michael Reed into the boardroom exactly 8 minutes later, and Sophia found herself studying every detail of the man who walked through those doors like she was trying to solve a puzzle that would make sense of her suddenly fractured reality. He was in his early 40s, wearing the dark blue uniform of the maintenance staff, his hands showing the calluses and wear of someone who worked with them every day, and his face registered confusion mixed with worry as his eyes immediately found the little girl standing near Sophia. "Emma, what are you doing up here?" His voice carried a mix of concern and mild panic as he crossed the room toward his daughter. "I told you to wait downstairs in the break area. You can't just wander around the executive floors." He glanced around at the dozen pairs of eyes fixed on him with varying degrees of intensity. "I'm really sorry if she bothered anyone. She was just supposed to be reading her book while I finished my shift." Sophia's voice cut through his apology like a blade, controlled but with an edge sharp enough to draw blood. "Mr. Reed, where did you get this watch?" She held it up between them, letting it catch the light, and she saw something shift in his expression, something defensive and protective that made her pulse quicken. Michael looked at the watch, then back at Sophia, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "That's mine. I'd like it back, please." The presumption in his tone, the suggestion that he had any right to something that belonged to her father, sent a flash of anger through Sophia's chest. "I asked you a question. Where did you get it?" David stood from his chair, his voice taking on the smooth diplomatic tone he used when trying to defuse tense situations. "Miss Bennett, surely this is just a misunderstanding. The man obviously purchased it secondhand somewhere, maybe at an estate sale or a thrift store. There's no reason to interrogate him like he's committed some crime." Sophia didn't take her eyes off Michael. "Sit down, David." The command in her voice made it clear this wasn't a request, and after a moment of tense silence, David slowly lowered himself back into his chair. Sophia took a step closer to Michael, close enough to see the fine lines around his eyes, the slight scar on his chin, the way his hands had curled into defensive fists at his sides. "This watch belonged to my father. He was wearing it when he died 9 years ago in a car accident. His body was never recovered from the river. So I'll ask you one more time, and I suggest you answer carefully. Where did you get this watch?" The color drained from Michael's face so quickly that Sophia thought he might actually faint, and she saw him swallow hard, his eyes darting to Emma, who was watching the exchange with growing distress. "I didn't steal it," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "I swear on my daughter's life, I didn't steal it from anyone." Sophia felt her heart hammering against her ribs. Then explain to me how you have my father's watch, Mr. Reed, because right now the only explanations I can think of are ones that end with you in a police interrogation room. Michael closed his eyes for a long moment, and when he opened them again, there was something resigned in his expression, like he'd been carrying a weight for years and was finally about to set it down. 9 years ago, I was working at a shipping warehouse about 200 miles from here. Night shift, loading trucks, the kind of work that pays the bills but doesn't ask questions about your past. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. It was around 3 in the morning on a Thursday when I heard something outside the loading dock, a sound like someone had fallen or collapsed. I went to check and found a man lying in the alley behind the building. He was in terrible shape, bleeding from his head. His face was swollen and covered in bruises. His clothes were torn and soaked through, and he was barely conscious. Sophia felt the room tilt around her, felt her knees go weak, and she had to grip the back of a chair to stay upright as Michael continued speaking, his words falling like hammer blows against everything she thought she knew. I called an ambulance immediately, stayed with him until they arrived. He kept trying to say something, but I couldn't understand him. His speech was slurred, confused, like he didn't know where he was or what had happened to him. Michael's eyes met Sophia's, and she saw truth there, raw and unvarnished. The paramedics took him to the regional medical center, and I don't know why. Maybe it was because I felt responsible, or maybe I just needed to know he was okay. But I went to visit him the next day. The doctors told me he had severe head trauma, multiple fractures, and complete memory loss. He couldn't tell them his name, where he was from, if he had family, nothing. It was like someone had erased his entire existence. The room had gone so quiet that Sophia could hear the hum of the air conditioning, the distant sound of traffic from the streets below, and her own ragged breathing as she tried to process what she was hearing. What happened to him? Her voice came out barely above a whisper, and she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Michael ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that spoke of old frustration and helplessness. The hospital kept him for about a month, running every test they could think of, checking fingerprint databases, dental records, missing persons reports across multiple states. Nothing came back. No one claimed him. It was like he'd never existed. He looked down at Emma, who had moved to stand beside him, her small hand finding his. Eventually, they had to transfer him to a state-run care facility because the hospital couldn't justify keeping him indefinitely without insurance or identification. He was moved to a long-term facility, and I tried to visit him a few times after that, but they had strict privacy policies and wouldn't let me see him because I wasn't family. Sophia felt tears burning in her eyes, felt 9 years of carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. "The watch," she managed to say. "How did you get the watch?" Michael's expression softened slightly. "Before they transferred him, one of the nurses gave me his personal effects. Just the clothes he'd been wearing, which were basically rags, and this watch. She said if no one claimed him after 6 months, everything would be disposed of or donated. I kept the watch because it seemed important because of the engraving. I thought maybe someday his memory would come back and I could return it to him, help him find out who he was." He looked at Sophia with something like understanding dawning in his eyes. "I never knew who he was. I never knew about any car accident or any William Bennett. I just knew there was a man who needed help, and I did what I could." David's voice broke the silence that followed, and there was something in his tone that made Sophia's skin crawl, something forced and artificial in his laugh. "This is absolutely absurd, Sophia. You can't seriously believe that your father survived a car accident that destroyed his vehicle, somehow ended up 200 miles away, and has been sitting in some facility for 9 years. The odds of that are astronomical." Sophia turned to face David with an intensity that made him shift uncomfortably in his seat, and she felt something clicking into place in her mind. Pieces of a puzzle she hadn't even known existed suddenly forming a picture that made her blood run cold. "What did he look like, Mr. Reed? The man you found that night? Describe him to me in detail." Michael seemed taken aback by the urgency in her voice, but he closed his eyes, clearly trying to pull the memory from 9 years ago into sharp focus. He was tall, maybe 6 feet or slightly over. He had gray hair, or mostly gray with some darker streaks still mixed in. He looked like he was in his mid-50s, and despite the injuries, You could tell he'd been in good shape, like someone who took care of himself. He opened his eyes and looked at Sophia. There was something else, a distinctive scar on his right forearm, shaped almost like a crescent moon. I remember it because it looked old, like he'd had it for years. The room seemed to contract around Sophia as the air left her lungs in a rush, because her father had that exact scar, a childhood injury from a boating accident when he was 12 years old, something he'd told her about 100 times, a mark he'd carried his entire life. Her legs gave out and she sank into the nearest chair, the watch still clutched in her trembling hand. "You're describing William Bennett," she said, her voice breaking on her father's name. "You're describing my father exactly." David was on his feet now, his face flushed red with what looked like anger but might have been panic. "This is insane, Sophia. You're letting grief and wishful thinking cloud your judgment. The police investigated your father's accident thoroughly. They found his car at the bottom of that ravine, they found blood evidence, personal effects. Everything pointed to a fatal accident. The insurance company paid out millions. This is just some bizarre coincidence, or this man is lying for some reason we don't understand yet." But Sophia wasn't listening to him anymore because something was becoming horrifyingly clear in her mind. A thought so terrible that she could barely allow herself to think it. "They never found his body, David. You were there, you remember. They searched that river for 3 weeks and never found a body. They only declared him dead because the evidence suggested no one could have survived the crash and the fall into the water." She stood up slowly, her eyes fixed on David with an intensity that made him take a step back. "But what if there was no accident? What if someone staged it? What if someone wanted everyone to think he was dead while they kept him alive somewhere, unable to remember who he was, unable to tell anyone what really happened?" The implications of her words hit the room like a physical force, and Sophia saw shock register on the faces around the table, saw David's expression shift from red-faced anger to ashen-faced fear in the space of a heartbeat. Sophia pulled out her phone with shaking hands and dialed a number she hadn't called in years, a direct line to Detective Harrison from the original investigation into her father's disappearance. "Detective, this is Sophia Bennett, William Bennett's daughter. I need you to reopen my father's case immediately." She listened for a moment to the confused questions on the other end. "I know it's been 9 years, but I have new information, significant information. I have a witness who saw my father alive after the supposed accident, and I have reason to believe he's still alive right now in a state care facility." She gave him the details Michael had provided, watching David's face grow paler with each word she spoke. "I need you to check the records for that facility. Look for a John Doe admitted 9 years ago with severe amnesia and head trauma. And detective, I think someone staged my father's death, which means we're potentially looking at attempted murder and conspiracy." She ended the call and looked around the room at the executives who had been running her father's company, the people she trusted for 9 years. "I'm suspending this meeting indefinitely. Everyone out except Mr. Reed and David. The rest of you are to speak to no one about what you've heard here until I say otherwise. Is that understood?" The executives filed out quickly, their whispers following them like a wake as the door closed behind the last one, leaving just the 5 of them in the massive room. Sophia, David, Michael, Emma, and the ghost of William Bennett hanging over them all like a specter demanding justice. Sophia walked to the windows that overlooked the city, the empire her father had built, and she felt the weight of what she was about to say pressing down on her shoulders. "David, you've been with this company for 15 years. You were my father's right hand, his closest business partner. When he died, you helped me take over, guided me through the impossible grief and the business challenges." She turned to face him. "So I need you to tell me the truth right now. Did you know my father was alive?" David's face went through a series of expressions: shock, offense, fear, before settling on something that looked like wounded dignity. "How can you even ask me that? William was my friend, my mentor. His death destroyed me too. I've spent 9 years helping you honor his legacy." But Sophia had spent 9 years learning to read people, learning to see through the masks that executives wore, and she saw something in David's eyes that made her certain he was hiding something. "You're lying," she said quietly. "I don't know how you're involved or how much you know, but you're lying to me right now, and I want you out of my building. You're suspended effective immediately pending a full investigation." David's wounded dignity crumbled into something uglier, something desperate. "You can't do this, Sophia. The board won't stand for it. I have contracts, protections. You can't just throw me out based on paranoid accusations." Sophia walked toward him slowly, and there was something in her bearing that made this man who'd known her since she was a young woman taking over her father's company suddenly see her as dangerous. "I'm majority shareholder and CEO of this company. I can do whatever I want. And right now, I want you gone while I figure out what really happened to my father. Security will escort you out and you'll surrender your access cards, your company phone, and your laptop immediately. If I find out you knew anything about what happened to him and didn't tell me, I will destroy you. Do you understand me?" For a long moment, David stared at her, and Sophia saw calculation happening behind his eyes, saw him weighing options and outcomes. Then he grabbed his briefcase from the table and walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the handle to look back at her. "You're making a mistake, Sophia. Some stones are better left unturned. Your father wouldn't want you tearing apart everything he built chasing ghosts." The door slammed behind him hard enough to rattle the glass, and Sophia stood in the sudden silence, her heart pounding, knowing that she'd just declared war on whoever had taken her father from her, and that there was no going back now from whatever truth she was about to uncover. Sophia turned back to Michael Reed, who was still standing protectively beside his daughter, and she saw in his face a wariness that spoke of a man who'd learned not to trust people in power, people who could change his life with a word. "Mr. Reed, I need your help. I need you to come with me to find my father, to help me identify him and get him out of whatever facility he's been trapped in for 9 years. Michael's expression shifted to something between sympathy and concern as he looked down at Emma, whose small hand was still gripping his uniform sleeve. "Miss Bennett, I understand what you're going through, and I want to help, but I have a daughter to take care of. I can't just drop everything and leave. Emma's school, my job, our life, I can't risk all of that." Sophia felt desperation clawing at her throat, felt 9 years of grief and loss and unanswered questions threatening to overwhelm her. And she knew she was about to make an offer that would sound insane but was the only card she had left to play. "I'll pay you $30,000 to come with me right now and help me find him. If we get there and it's not my father, you keep the money anyway for your time and trouble. If it is him, if you help me bring him home, I'll triple it." She watched his eyes widen, watched him process numbers that probably represented more money than he'd see in 2 years of working night shifts as a custodian. "That's $90,000, Mr. Reed, for maybe 3 days of your time. I'll cover all expenses, arrange for Emma's care if needed. Make sure you don't lose your job here. But I need you because you're the only person who's seen him, the only one who knows what happened that night, and if he's really out there with no memory, thinking no one cares about him, thinking he's been abandoned." Her voice broke and tears spilled down her cheeks despite her best efforts to maintain control. Emma tugged on her father's sleeve, her young voice cutting through the tension in the room with the clarity that only children possess. "Dad, you should help her. She's really sad. And you always tell me we should help people when they're sad." Michael closed his eyes and Sophia saw the internal battle playing out across his features, saw the moment when compassion won out over caution. "Okay," he said finally, opening his eyes to meet Sophia's gaze. "I'll help you, but I need to make arrangements for Emma. Her grandmother lives about an hour from here. She can stay with her for a few days." Relief flooded through Sophia so powerfully that she had to sit down again, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. "Thank you. Thank you so much. We'll leave first thing in the morning. I'll have my assistant arrange everything, hotel rooms, transportation, whatever you need." She pulled out her phone and started making calls, her mind already racing ahead to the logistics, to what she'd need to bring, to what she'd say when she saw her father for the first time in 9 years. That night, Sophia sat in her father's old office at Bennett Technologies, a space she'd preserved exactly as he'd left it because she'd never had the heart to change anything. And she went through his files with new eyes, looking for clues she'd missed, looking for answers to questions she hadn't known to ask. She found his personal journal in the bottom drawer of his desk, a leather-bound book she'd seen him writing in countless times but had never opened after his death, because it felt like a violation of his privacy. Now she opened it with trembling hands and flipped through pages of his neat handwriting, business notes and meeting reminders and random thoughts, until she reached the entries from 9 years ago, from the weeks before he disappeared. The entry from 3 weeks before the accident made her blood run cold. Found discrepancies in the overseas accounts. Numbers don't match up with what David and Charles have been reporting. Someone's moving money, large amounts, through shell companies I don't recognize. Her father's handwriting became more agitated in the entries that followed, the neat script degenerating into something hurried and stressed. Confronted Charles about the accounts today. He got defensive, said I was seeing conspiracies where there were none, that the international markets were just complex and I didn't understand the new financial structures they'd implemented. But I'm not senile and I'm not stupid. Money is missing. The final entry was dated the day before the accident, and Sophia's hands shook so badly she could barely read it. David called an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning. Said we need to talk privately about the accounts, that he can explain everything. Meeting him at the old bridge overlook at dawn before the office opens. He sounded nervous. I'm bringing copies of everything I found, just in case. Sophia felt her world tilt on its axis as the implications crashed over her like a wave. Because her father had died at that bridge, his car had gone off that bridge into the river below, and David Morrison had been the last person scheduled to meet with him. She grabbed her laptop and pulled up the company's financial records, looking for the irregularities her father had mentioned, and once she knew what to look for, once she understood the pattern, she saw it everywhere. Millions of dollars moving through legitimate-looking transactions that led nowhere, money that should have been in Bennett Technologies' accounts but had somehow vanished into a web of offshore companies and shell corporations. By the time dawn broke outside her windows, Sophia had traced nearly $20 million in missing funds, all of it disappearing over the 5 years before her father's supposed accident. All of it connected through a maze of financial transactions that led back to 2 names, David Morrison and Charles Whitmore, the company's chief financial officer. Her father had discovered they were embezzling, and they'd made sure he couldn't tell anyone. And for 9 years she'd trusted these men, worked alongside them, taken their advice, let them help shape the company's future while they stole from it and from her. She pulled out her phone and called Detective Harrison again, not caring that it was barely 6 in the morning. Detective, I found something. My father's journal from before he disappeared. He was investigating financial fraud at the company. He'd found evidence of embezzlement and he was supposed to meet David Morrison, our COO, at the bridge the morning his car went off it. She listened to Harrison's sharp intake of breath on the other end. I think David and Charles Whitmore killed my father or tried to, and when he survived, they paid to keep him hidden. I'm sending you copies of everything I found. I want them arrested. Harrison's voice was careful, professional. Sophia, what you're describing is a major conspiracy. I'll need to bring in Financial Crimes Division, probably federal investigators. This is going to get very complicated very quickly. She looked out at the city waking up below her, at the empire built on lies and blood money. I don't care about complicated, detective. I care about finding my father and making sure the people who did this to him pay for it. They left 3 hours later in Sophia's personal vehicle, a black SUV with tinted windows that offered at least some protection from the media attention she knew was coming once this story broke. Michael sat in the passenger seat looking uncomfortable, surrounded by leather and luxury, while Sophia drove with a focus that bordered on manic, her mind unable to settle on anything except the thought that her father might be alive, that she might see him again, that 9 years of grief might have been based on a lie. You didn't sleep, did you? Michael's quiet observation broke the silence that had stretched between them for the first hour of the drive. I couldn't. I kept thinking about what he's been through, kept imagining him in some facility, wondering why no one came for him, why no one loved him enough to find him. Her voice cracked despite her efforts to stay strong. Michael was quiet for a moment before speaking again. Miss Bennett, I need to prepare you for something. Even if this man is your father, even if we find him, he won't know you. The doctors told me his memory loss was complete and permanent. He's built a new life, a new identity, around not knowing who he was. Confronting him with his past might be traumatic for him. Sophia's hands tightened on the steering wheel until her knuckles went white. He deserves to know the truth. He deserves to know he has a daughter who never stopped loving him, who never stopped missing him. Whatever trauma that causes, we'll deal with it together. But I won't leave him trapped in ignorance when I can give him back his life. They drove in silence after that, both lost in their own thoughts, until Sophia's phone rang through the car's speakers and Detective Harrison's voice filled the vehicle with news that made her swerve slightly in shock. Sophia, David Morrison has disappeared. His house is empty, his car is gone, and his credit cards haven't been used since yesterday afternoon. We've issued a warrant for his arrest, but I'm afraid he's running. The care facility sat behind high fences topped with razor wire, looking more like a prison than a place meant to help people. And Sophia felt her stomach twist into knots as she pulled into the visitor parking lot and cut the engine. The building itself was a sprawling complex of gray concrete and small windows, institutional and cold, the kind of place designed for efficiency rather than comfort, where people were stored rather than cared for. Michael looked at the building and she saw something dark pass across his features. I should have done more 9 years ago. I should have kept visiting. Should have fought harder to see him. Should have done something other than just keeping his watch like that was enough. Sophia reached over and touched his arm, a gesture that surprised them both. You saved his life that night. You called for help when you could have just walked away. You kept his watch safe for 9 years hoping someone would claim it. You did everything you could have done, and now you're here helping me find him. That's more than most people would do for a stranger. They walked to the entrance together, and Sophia felt her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs as they stepped into a lobby that smelled of disinfectant and despair, where a receptionist sat behind thick security glass looking at them with the dead-eyed expression of someone who'd seen too much human suffering and had learned to stop caring. Sophia approached the window and tried to keep her voice steady. I'm here to see a patient, a John Doe who was admitted 9 years ago from the Regional Medical Center with amnesia and head trauma. The receptionist didn't even look up from her computer screen. Visiting hours don't start until 1 p.m. Come back then. Something in Sophia snapped. 9 years of grief and loss and carefully maintained control finally breaking through the professional facade she'd built. I'm not leaving. The patient you have here is my father, William Bennett. He's been missing for 9 years and I've just found out he's alive and here. I need to see him right now. The receptionist finally looked up, her expression shifting from boredom to something like curiosity. You'll need to speak with Dr. Martinez, the facility director. He handles all identification and release situations. She picked up a phone and spoke quietly, then pointed down a hallway that stretched into fluorescent-lit distance. Third door on the left. He's expecting you. Dr. Martinez was a thin man in his 60s with tired eyes and the stooped posture of someone carrying too much responsibility for too long. And when Sophia and Michael entered his office, he gestured for them to sit with the weariness of someone who'd had this conversation too many times. Miss Bennett, I understand you believe one of our long-term residents is your father. I need you to understand that we have very strict protocols about patient privacy and identification. Even if you're correct, releasing him to your custody will require extensive documentation, DNA verification, legal proceedings that could take months. Sophia leaned forward, her eyes locked on his with an intensity that made him shift uncomfortably in his chair. Doctor, my father was attacked and left for dead 9 years ago. Someone staged his death and has been paying to keep him here ever since, unable to remember who he is or where he came from. The people responsible are currently fleeing to avoid arrest. Every moment he stays here is another moment they have to cover their tracks or worse, to try to finish what they started. I'm not asking for him to be released immediately, but I need to see him right now to confirm it's him. Dr. Martinez studied her for a long moment, then pulled up files on his computer, his fingers moving slowly across the keyboard. We do have a resident matching the general description, admitted 9 years ago as John Doe, severe retrograde amnesia with no memory recovery. He's been a model resident, quiet, keeps to himself mostly, spends his time drawing and working in our workshop. He looked up at Sophia. Before I take you to him, I need to warn you that this will be difficult. If this is your father, he won't recognize you. He's built an entire identity around not knowing his past. This could be very traumatic for both of you. Sophia stood up, her decision made. I understand the risks, doctor. But I've waited 9 years for this moment. I'm not waiting another minute. They walked through corridors that seemed designed to strip away hope, past rooms where people sat staring at walls or wandering in circles, and Sophia felt tears burning in her eyes at the thought of her father spending 9 years in this place, surrounded by this institutional misery. Dr. Martinez stopped outside a door marked with just a number. No name, no identity, nothing to distinguish it from dozens of others. He's in here. We call him John because he needed something to respond to. He spends most of his time working on mechanical drawings, quite detailed and sophisticated actually. We've never understood where that skill came from. Sophia's heart nearly stopped because her father had been a mechanical engineer before building his technology company, had spent hours at home sketching designs and inventions, filling notebooks with his precise technical drawings. Dr. Martinez knocked gently and pushed the door open. John, you have visitors. Someone who thinks they might know you from before. The room was small and sparse. A narrow bed with a thin blanket, a metal dresser, a desk by the window covered in papers and pencils, and sitting at that desk with his back to them was a man with gray hair hunched over a sketch pad. John, Dr. Martinez said again, his voice gentle, there's someone here to see you. The man turned around slowly, and Sophia felt the world stop spinning as she looked at her father's face for the first time in 9 years. He was thinner, his face more lined, his hair completely gray now instead of the salt and pepper she remembered. But it was him, those eyes, that nose, the slight tilt of his head when he was confused. Everything about him screamed that this was William Bennett, her father, the man she'd mourned for 9 years. Dad. The word came out broken and wet with tears, and Sophia saw confusion wash across his face as he looked at her. This woman claiming to know him when his own mind offered nothing but emptiness where memories should be. I'm sorry, he said, his voice exactly as she remembered it, maybe rougher from years of disuse but unmistakably his. Do I know you? I don't remember having a daughter. I don't remember anything really. Michael stepped forward, his hand on Sophia's shoulder as she swayed. Sir, my name is Michael Reed. I'm the one who found you 9 years ago who called the ambulance. This is Sophia Bennett, and she's been searching for you ever since you disappeared. We're here to take you home. William, John. This man who was both and neither stared at them with something like longing mixed with fear in his eyes. I've had dreams sometimes about a little girl with dark hair and brown eyes. She's laughing and calling me daddy. We're building something together, maybe a treehouse or a boat. I can never quite remember, but I always wake up thinking it felt real, felt like a memory instead of just a dream. Sophia couldn't hold back the sob that tore from her chest. It was real, Dad. All of it was real. You used to build things with me every weekend. You taught me how to use tools, how to design structures, how to think like an engineer. That wasn't a dream. That was your life, our life together, and someone took it from you. But I'm here now and I'm going to help you get it all back. She took a step toward him, her hand outstretched, and she saw him looking at her with such raw emotion that it broke her heart all over again. This stranger who was her father, trying to reconcile the emptiness in his mind with the certainty in her voice. And in that moment, Sophia Bennett knew that finding him was only the beginning of a much longer journey to bring him home. The next 3 hours were a blur of paperwork and phone calls as Sophia's lawyers worked frantically to expedite William's release from the facility, and she watched through the glass window of Dr. Martinez's office as her father sat in his room with Michael, the two of them talking quietly while Emma drew pictures at the small desk. Detective Harrison called with updates that made Sophia's blood run cold. David Morrison had been spotted at a private airfield attempting to charter a plane, and when police moved in to arrest him, he tried to run and been tackled by officers, screaming that he'd done nothing wrong, that everything had been Charles Whitmore's idea. Charles himself had vanished completely, his mansion empty, his bank accounts cleaned out, and his private jet had filed a flight plan to a country with no extradition treaty 3 hours before the arrest warrant was issued. We'll find him, Harrison assured her. We've already contacted Interpol and frozen what assets we can. He can run, but he can't hide forever, and with David in custody, we have someone who can testify about what really happened 9 years ago. Sophia stood at the window watching her father, this man who'd built an empire and raised her and taught her everything that mattered, now sitting in a bare room with no memory of any of it, and she felt rage burning through her grief like acid. What did David say? Did he admit what they did? Harrison's voice was grim. He's already cut a deal with the prosecutors. In exchange for testimony against Charles and a reduced sentence, he's telling us everything. According to his statement, your father confronted them about the embezzlement and threatened to go to the authorities. Charles panicked and convinced David that they had no choice, that your father would destroy both of them and the company if the truth came out. They hired 2 men to make it look like an accident, staged the car going off the bridge, but the hired muscle got overzealous and beat your father nearly to death before dumping him in the river. They thought he was dead when they pushed the car over, but somehow he survived, crawled out of the water, and wandered until Michael found him miles away. Sophia closed her eyes against the images flooding her mind. Her father beaten and broken, left to drown, fighting his way to shore through sheer will only to lose everything he was in the process. And when they found out he survived? Harrison was quiet for a moment. David says Charles found out through a private investigator he'd hired to make sure there were no loose ends. When the investigator reported that a John Doe matching your father's description had been admitted to the medical center with amnesia, Charles saw an opportunity. He set up the offshore account to pay for your father's care at this facility, made sure he stayed comfortable and hidden. David claims he argued against it, wanted to come clean, but Charles threatened him, said they were in too deep and if your father's memory ever came back, they'd both go to prison for attempted murder. Sophia felt something dark and violent stirring in her chest, a desire for vengeance that scared her with its intensity. I want them both to pay for every second he spent in this place, every memory he lost, every moment I thought he was dead. I want them to suffer the way we suffered. She hung up and turned to find Dr. Martinez standing in the doorway holding a thick folder. The paperwork is processed. You can take him with you, but Miss Bennett, I need you to understand that this is just the beginning. He'll need extensive therapy, medical care, psychiatric evaluation. His memory may never fully return, and even if fragments do come back, they could be traumatic or disorienting. You're not just getting your father back. You're taking responsibility for a man who's essentially been living as someone else for 9 years. Sophia met his eyes with steel in her own. He's my father. I'll do whatever it takes. She walked into William's room and knelt in front of where he sat, taking his hands in hers, feeling the familiar roughness of his palms. The same hands that had taught her to ride a bike and tie her shoes and believe in herself. Dad, we're going home. I know you don't remember it, but I'm going to show you everything, tell you everything, and whether your memory comes back or not, I'm going to make sure you know every day how loved you are, how much you were missed, how many people are going to be so happy to know you're alive. William looked at her with tears in his eyes, this broken man who'd been her hero, and he squeezed her hands gently. I don't understand why you're doing this for someone you don't really know anymore, but thank you. Thank you for not giving up on me, for finding me when everyone else forgot I existed. They left the facility as the sun was setting, William walking between Sophia and Michael like a man leaving prison after years of unjust confinement. And Sophia saw him stop at the gate to look back at the building that had been his entire world. I used to dream about leaving, he said quietly. Used to imagine someone would come and tell me who I was, take me to wherever I belonged. But after a few years, I stopped dreaming. Started accepting that maybe I was nobody, that maybe this was all there was. He turned to look at Sophia. You gave me back hope today, even if you can't give me back my memories. That's a gift I don't know how to repay. The drive back was tense because Sophia kept checking the rearview mirror, kept expecting to see the black SUVs of hired killers coming after them, kept thinking about Charles Whitmore somewhere out there with millions in stolen money and every reason to want her father dead before he could testify. Michael seemed to sense her anxiety because he kept his hand near his phone, ready to call police at the first sign of trouble, and Emma sat in the back next to William, showing him her drawings and chattering away with the easy acceptance of childhood that didn't need memory to form connection. They were an hour from home when Sophia's phone rang with a number she didn't recognize, and when she answered, Charles Whitmore's voice filled her car with poison and threats. Sophia, dear, you've made a terrible mistake bringing him back. I had hoped we could let sleeping dogs lie, but you've forced my hand. I want you to know that I'm watching you right now, watching all of you, And unless you turn around and take him back to that facility and forget any of this ever happened, there will be consequences. Sophia felt ice flooding her veins but kept her voice steady. You're finished, Charles. David's already confessed everything. The police are looking for you, the feds are freezing your assets, and when we get home, my father is going to testify to what you did to him. You can threaten me all you want, but you've already lost. Charles's laugh was cold and brittle. Have I? Because from where I'm sitting, I still have resources you can't imagine. Contacts in places that don't care about your laws or your justice. I spent 9 years making sure your father stayed buried, and I can make sure he stays buried permanently if you don't cooperate. Last chance, Sophia. Take him back. She looked in the rearview mirror at her father sitting next to Emma, looking confused and worried, and she thought about 9 years of lies and grief and stolen time. Go to hell, Charles. We're not turning around. And when they catch you, I'm going to be there to watch you go to prison for the rest of your miserable life. She hung up and immediately called Detective Harrison. Charles just called me. He's threatening us, said he's watching us. I think he's going to try something. Harrison's response was immediate. Where are you right now? Give me your exact location. Sophia rattled off the highway and mile marker just as she saw headlights in her rearview mirror. A large black vehicle accelerating toward them fast. Too fast to be normal traffic. Harrison, we've got company. Black SUV closing fast from behind. Michael had seen it too and was already reaching for Emma, pulling her down low in the seat. Sophia, drive faster. Get off at the next exit. Do something to lose them. But the SUV was already alongside them, and Sophia saw the passenger window rolling down, saw the dark shape of a weapon emerging, and she did the only thing she could think of. She slammed on the brakes. The SUV shot past them, its tires screaming as the driver tried to compensate, and Sophia yanked the wheel hard right, taking an exit ramp at dangerous speed, her vehicle tilting sickeningly before the tires found traction. Behind them, the SUV had recovered and was following, and Sophia could hear Harrison shouting through the phone that was now on the floor, demanding to know what was happening, promising that units were being dispatched to their location. She drove like a woman possessed, taking turns at speeds that made Michael grip the door handle white-knuckled, weaving through traffic on surface streets until she saw the flashing lights of police cars ahead, a roadblock that Harrison must have ordered, and she accelerated toward it like it was salvation itself. The SUV behind them must have seen it too because it suddenly veered off down a side street, disappearing into the maze of the city, and Sophia finally allowed herself to slow down as police surrounded her vehicle, officers with weapons drawn until they confirmed who she was. She sat there shaking, her hands still gripping the steering wheel, while Michael checked on Emma and William in the back, making sure they were okay, and through her window she saw Detective Harrison running toward them, his face twisted with concern and fury. They spent the next hour at a police station giving statements while officers searched for the SUV and its occupants, and Harrison informed them that Charles had been traced to a private estate just outside the city, where a tactical team was preparing to move in. You're all going to safe house tonight, Harrison said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Until we have Charles in custody, you're all at risk, and I'm not taking any chances with your lives. But Sophia shook her head, feeling the stubbornness that had built an empire rising in her. No, we're going home to my father's house, the one he built with his own hands, and we're going to wait there for news that Charles has been arrested. I'm not running anymore, not hiding, not letting that bastard have one more second of power over our lives. Harrison started to argue, but something in her expression stopped him, and he finally nodded. I'll have officers stationed outside around the clock. But Sophia, promise me you'll be careful. Charles is desperate, and desperate men do desperate things. They drove to her father's house, a beautiful old structure in the hills that Sophia had maintained but rarely visited because it hurt too much, and as they pulled into the driveway, she saw William staring at it with something like recognition flickering in his eyes. I know this place, he whispered. I built this. I remember cutting the wood for those beams. Remember designing the porch to catch the morning sun. Remember everything about making this house into a home. Sophia felt tears streaming down her face as she took his hand. This is where you taught me to be strong, where you showed me what it meant to build something that lasts. This is where we're going to start rebuilding your life, one memory at a time, and I don't care how long it takes or how hard it is, because I have you back and that's all that matters." They went inside together and Michael made coffee while Emma fell asleep on the couch, exhausted from the day's trauma, and Sophia showed her father photographs from before the accident, pictures of them together, of her mother who died when Sophia was young, of the company he'd built and the life he'd lived. William studied each image with intensity, and sometimes she saw recognition flash across his face, memories surfacing like fish breaking water before disappearing back into the depths. Just after midnight, Harrison called with news that made Sophia's heart soar. Charles Whitmore had been arrested attempting to flee through a tunnel from his estate, and he was now in custody facing charges of attempted murder, conspiracy, embezzlement, kidnapping, and a dozen other crimes that would ensure he never saw freedom again. "It's over, Sophia," Harrison said. "You can finally rest." But as she looked around at her father trying to piece together a life he couldn't remember, at Michael and Emma who'd risked everything to help her, at the empire she'd have to rebuild now that the truth was out, Sophia knew it wasn't over at all. It was just beginning, the hard work of healing and remembering and forgiving and moving forward. But for the first time in 9 years, she felt something like hope burning in her chest, because her father was alive, the people who'd hurt him were facing justice, and every moment from here forward was a gift they'd all fought too hard to take for granted. And that was enough, that was everything, that was worth all the pain and fear and loss, because in the end, love had won, truth had won, and they were finally, after 9 long years, home.